All right, this is a History 1302 lecture on the Old West, and today we pick up with the beginnings of the Old West and what draws people to what is the Midwest and the Mountain West. The Old West is a mythologized part of American history, especially in the early to mid 20th century with the development of radio, television, and especially movies. Many of our ancestors, many of our grandparents and great-grandparents grew up watching TV shows that glorified the cowboy mythology. Many of our ancestors, grandparents, and great-grandparents grew up watching movies that were starred John Wayne or Gary Cooper, where they play cowboys or they play sheriffs or they play some other sort of lawman or perhaps individual, a great cattleman, as he is trying to stave off this change or affect that change, or he's going to go have a shootout at high noon on the OK Corral. Literally, the movie is called High Noon, and it is the setting, the genre by which every other sort of movie is done. And so the Old West has been mythologized. There is some truth in that that we see in the movies, but oftentimes not a lot. Obviously, when we talk about these Old West towns, it was a lot more quiet for the most part than what you see that these sporadic violences that break out in these movies. At the same time, however, these towns, especially the mining camps and the cattle towns, could be rough and rowdy affairs, even in the real life of, say, Dodge City, Kansas, or Tombstone, Arizona. But before we get to that part of the Western heritage and history, we need to talk about why it is that people find their way to the West and find their way to the Mountain West or to the Midwest in the late 19th century. And really where we pick up is going to be somewhere at the end of the Civil War, so 1865, but really going into the 1870s, 80s, and really peters out by about 1890 or 95. So what draws people to the Midwest? A lot of it has to do with the promise of free and cheap land. And you can thank Abraham Lincoln's Homestead Act for that gave away land for just a pittance. And many people will be drawn by the dream of moving on to the Great Plains. And the idea of being a homeowner, but more especially a landowner, which was mighty, mighty attractive. Well, in addition to the dreams of cheap and frankly free land ownership there on the plains or even in the mountains, you will see people drawn by the promise of cheap land by the railroads. So on the one hand, the federal government is giving away lots and lots of land in this era, and then they're trying to populate the Midwest. And really, I should say this, it's part of that Henry Clay Whig idea that was adopted by Abraham Lincoln, that one of the greatest ways to build wealth and to create a strong middle class or a strong owner class is to have men and women own their land, own real estate. And so they are encouraging this. It was one of the great debates actually right before the Civil War, and it is certainly one that the Whigs and the Republican descendants are going to push through during the war. So go, go, go. So federal government's going to give you one. But the second aspect of the drawing of people to the Midwest is going to come from the railroads themselves. One of the things we see in the West and in the South throughout the Civil War era and beyond, all the way through to about the year 1900, and then it just kind of like a wave rolling out slows down. But we find that one of the great manias of the time period, one of the great ideas of the time period is the need to build a railroad. We need to build railroads. It's true for small towns. It's true for states. It's true for the federal government. There is this great desire, and it transcends political parties for the most part. How these parties will go about it's another story, but both political parties, the nation as a whole, with some reservations, are going to say we need to build railroads. Railroads are the answer to all of life's problems, almost is the way they might say it. Now, obviously, no thinking man would say that the railroad is the answer to all of life's problems, but you will see a lot of individuals say our town needs a railroad and we must have it. You will see variations of that theme to this day. You will see people, I will use the city of San Antonio in a much more modern sense. In the late 1980s, San Antonio was told, if you just build a Alamo Dome, if you build a football stadium, San Antonio is such an attractive city, such a growing city, that people will want to, the NFL will want to bring a football team to San Antonio, Texas. Well, it didn't happen, but at the same time, that sort of promise of the bounty of money just showering down upon a community if you just build something and they will come, to kind of paraphrase Field of Dreams. The railroads were that in the 19th century. So you'll see small towns, communities, states, and the federal government trying to build railroads. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture. But when it comes to the railroads, one of the ways they are being built is by the giving of land to the railroad company, the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Northern Pacific, and on these, all of these railroads seemingly have Pacific in their name, one way or the other, is that the federal government will shower not just money and bonds upon them, they will shower land upon them and say, here's land. You can have this for building a transcontinental railroad from, say, Chicago, or from Kansas, from Atchison, Kansas, and to cross the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas. Or if you're talking about the southern route down through Arizona and Texas and so on. But all these transcontinental railroads, to one degree or another, will be given a land to build the railroad. How does land have value in and of itself? Not exactly, but at the same time, obviously, it's valuable if people desire it. And so one of the ways the railroads are going to sell this land out and the railroads themselves don't want the land just for the sake to own the land. They're going to want the land to be sold, and the way you do that is you lay out towns and you create these towns along these train routes, named for investors, by the way. And they will draw people from the eastern United States, folks who are hard luck after the American Civil War, or even Southerners. It could be Northerners or Southerners now. And they would be drawn westward by promises of free and cheap and abundant land, a new community, a new life, a new starting place. So you'll have Americans, is ultimately my point. Americans will go westward to fill up these towns. But beyond that, and this is also a theme that we'll develop more in the coming weeks of lecture, is that you're going to see great migrations come into the United States after the Civil War. You had migration. The United States is famously and one of the great banalities of American civic life is that America is a nation of immigrants. Yes, that's true. In a sense, we all are immigrants to the Americas, whether it's recent or distant. The fact of the matter is that you will have one of the great migrations into the United States after the Civil War, some of whom are Scandinavian, some of whom are Italian, some of whom are from elsewhere in Europe and so on, Asia, if you're looking out toward the California coast. And that has to do with the building of railroads. We'll talk about that more later. But the thing is that even if they're never going to work on the railroad, but the railroads will send out agents promoting living in this new America, living in this America where there's a seemingly proper rain at just the right time. There's going to be trees. The wind doesn't blow all the time. All those sorts of things. It's almost like Eden has been found. If you're familiar with the Bible's creation account, that Eden has been found, and it is in the United States, and it is in the Midwest, and it is in the mountains, and it's no longer the great desert. Now, it was some truth to the fact that it does rain. It's some truth to the fact that the wind relaxes. It is some truth that there are trees in the Midwest. But it's largely a lot of pie in the sky and a lot of hopes and dreams. And one of the things you're going to do if you're the railroad is you're going to project this better life. And you want to let people believe that. It's because you're trying to get them to buy into it, and they're going to take and run with it. So anyways, they do. And thousands of immigrants, not just native-born Americans or old-line Americans, but thousands of immigrants will move up onto the plains. Depends on the territory, depends on the state, depends on where they come from and where you find them. But you'll find them all throughout the Midwest, all throughout the plains, and even into the mountains as well, trying to scratch out their living and scratch out their existence. So that's one of the great draws of the whole thing. Additionally speaking, when we talk about the growing of these cities and the building of these cities, it is fair to remember, and it is important to remember, that these towns need the railroad. And that is a truism that I will come back and hammer away at from time to time in a 1302 class. The railroad is really, in a sense, the first of the great industries in the United States. There are industries that predate the Civil War, but especially after the Civil War, we recognize this as one of the great industries that is out there. But anyways, regarding the railroads, it is a simple fact that business goes where the traffic flows. Today, if you're to open a business, it would make no sense unless you are just a niche business that will draw people like pilgrims on a pilgrimage. It makes no sense to try to open a restaurant out in the middle of an open field. It makes no sense to open a restaurant out in the middle of nowhere and hope people will find you, unless you are, of course, a celebrity like Chip and Joanna. This may date myself a little bit in the sense that who knows how long I use this video, but Chip and Joanna of Magnolia fame up at Waco. People will drive to go eat at Chip and Joanna's cafe there on the Circle in Waco. People will not drive to eat at the Greasy Spoon at Two Forks in the Road, Kansas, owned by two good folk, but a husband and wife team or something like that, but really undistinguished. So you need to be where the traffic is. And in a modern sense, of course, that's roads and highways and interstates and federal highways and state highways. If you can get yourself on a state highway, I think locally here, if you could set up let's say a town I'm very familiar with is the town of Caldwell, which is right down the road from Bryan and College Station. Two major intersections come through, Highway 21, which runs from San Marcos just below Austin and then comes through Bryan and College Station and runs all the way to Nacogdoches into the state line. Whether it's Highway 21 going essentially east to west, or at least southwest to northeast. The fact is you also have Highway 36, which is also a major artery running from Temple and beyond to Abilene all the way back down to the coast. Anyways, if you were to open up a restaurant there, it would attract a good restaurant or even just a average restaurant, but you offered a shtick or some sort of kitsch that would draw people in, you can make money because traffic flows there. In the 19th century especially, and even into the 20th century at the early decades, the railroad was that artery. That railroad was that conduit of business and travelers and such. And you will see people open up shops and businesses along the railroad, and towns will flourish because of the railroad. If you did not have a railroad, you had no future. It was just an understood and accepted aspect of life back in days gone by. So when we talk about these railroads, we talk about the railroads giving life. That is a theme that you're going to see me develop, not just in this lecture, but in the coming railroad lectures. It's certainly true in the Midwest, and it's true throughout the United States. Sometimes it was self-fulfilling prophecy. Other times it was hard-nosed fact. But these railroads will draw people out there, and these businesses and these little towns will thrive or wither if they don't stay on the railroad. So if you're to build a town, say on the railroad, or even if it's just off the beaten path, not too far away, of course, but if you were to build a little town, what would you need? And so we'll start off with these businesses that are very important to these communities. Why? What do you need, and what type of business do you want in your little community in Kansas, or your little community in Colorado, or the Arizona territory? Well, the first one, and probably in a sense you would think the most important, but it's not. It's actually what we would describe as the second most important business in all of what it makes a town to grow, is that of the shebang, also known as the general store. The shebang, S-H-E-B-A-N-G, the shebang is a development. The shebang is a store. It's kind of like the Walmart of the era. Maybe a better one even now, 2020, would be the Amazon of the age. What I mean by that is that in a good shebang, or a good general store, you could find seemingly anything you could need, from tools and supplies for mining or farming purposes. Depends on the community, depends on what they carry. You can find coffee, you can find sweets and sugars. You might even find some food, canned foods and such, of tobacco, also blankets and clothes, and on I can go. And even probably a little bit beyond that too. But these shebangs also acted as a community center, and that's worth noting too, is that you'll, in small towns, even to this day, but especially small towns in the 19th century, or even big cities, you'll see it in their way. But one of the things you'll notice about these general stores, and also the taverns as well, and tavern, of course, is different from a general store, is that you'll notice that there is a social component, especially in these windswept Midwest towns. Let's just say you're a farmer and it's in the middle of the winter and everything's pretty quiet. You've done all you needed to do, and you might not even been able to plant yet. You're waiting for the first sign of spring, or the right sign of spring, as it were, to start planting your crop. But you've got time on your hands. It's January, and it's not particularly cold. It's not warm. And so you travel into town to check on and to go get the mail, perhaps, because you need a post office, right? So you go get your mail, and by chance you stop into the general store because it allows you to mix with other human beings, and you get to see them. And so you spend time around a potbelly stove. You can look it up and see why they're called potbelly, but it's kind of the name's indicative of why they are. And you sit there and you talk and you you jibber jabber and chit chat with your friends and neighbors and the proprietor. And the thing is that it was often complained about by these store owners that these men would sit around these potbelly stoves keeping warm. And I don't want to make it sound like it was a Democratic National Convention in there, but there were probably a half a dozen or more at any one time, maybe a little higher. And these men would be sitting around telling stories, trading gossip, and then as soon as somebody walks in, "Hey Joe, how's it going?" They would, wave and draw them in, and maybe the guy sits down, maybe he doesn't, maybe he goes on. And of course, as soon as he walks out, they start gossiping about him and, what a failure he was as a husband, or, by gosh, he had a great crop, and did you hear what his kid did, and so on. In a modern sense, that's probably more true today out at convenience store or something like that, if you've ever lived in a small town. But, that was the way it worked at a shebang or a general store. So there's definitely a component, a social component to these general stores in addition to the taverns and so on. Speaking of which, you're going to have, especially in wild and woolly towns that were legitimately wild, especially the cow towns and especially the mining camps, you would have more than a few taverns. It depends on the clientele, depends on what that tavern is up to. Sometimes they sell the rot gut intoxicants. Sometimes they sell the finer stuff, and it depends on what you're trying to have. Do these taverns have faro games? Do these taverns have poker? Do these taverns have gambling in it? Maybe so. Probably so, in fact. Do these taverns also have a stage so somebody can sing and dance if you have a traveling troupe come through? That happens occasionally as well. A piano to entertain, a long bar for people to belly up to, a big mirror. Maybe even in the early or late 19th and early 20th century, you will see these prints put out by some beer makers of scantily clad individuals. The thing is that these taverns not only acted as a place where one could wet his whistle, but they also had that social component. You could meet other individuals, you can play cards, you can tell stories, get into fights. Again, it depends on what the town allows and what they don't, what they wink at and what they sternly refuse. But you might even have in the employment the proprietor acting as an agent, and that's the polite term for it. But you may even have these proprietors acting as this tavern might have be a part bordello or something of that nature. You'll see that too. So, and even still further, these taverns, sometimes if they're big enough or the proprietor is wealthy enough when he builds it, he may have built with a mind to having a hotel or an inn attached to it. And so there is that sort of traffic going on. And they might even have a Greasy Spoon restaurant in the back, which means basically that they weren't that good, they weren't that bad, they were just kind of, the name implies, greasy spoons. They were kind of, average fare sort of thing. Anyways, but you could find a lot in these taverns. You could find sleep, you could find rest, refreshment, and so on. And sometimes they were clean, often, frankly, fairly dirty and grungy. And especially in these hot and bothered towns such as a cow town or a mining camp, you will see these tavern inns or these hotels. They run their beds in about an 8-hour circuit. So basically 3 circuits a day. So you get 8 hours in a room. That's what you rent it for. You sleep, you refresh, you get up, you go. And the next they may change the sheets. They may not. Heck, they may not even really have much of a bed. So bed bugs and lice and other sorts of creepy crawlies were quite common in these hotels and these taverns and inns that had beds for rent in there. And so especially in the hot places, in the hot towns, they would rent them just for a few hours at a time so they could get maximum dollars for it. So these taverns, they have a real role to play. So if you're riding into town and you wanted to get cleaned up, several things to keep in mind here. First of all, you've got to do something with so you got to do something as far as your horse is concerned when you ride into town. You're probably going to put the horse in a livery stable. A livery stable is like a spa for a horse. That's probably a little bit of an exaggeration on my part, but it's essentially correct. The horse, especially if it's been a hard ride up in the plains, maybe you and the horse have traveled a couple of 100 miles or something like that. Who knows? You ride into town and the horse is kind of worn down and weathered. If you've ever ridden a horse or handled animals before, you work them hard, they will lose weight. And this horse needs to be fattened up. He needs to have some wounds salved. Say, if you've never ridden a horse for extended periods of time, their flank girt and their girt strap and so forth, they'll start to rub sores on these horses. And just like a blister on your foot because of an ill-fitting shoe or something of that nature. All of which is to say is that that horse needs to be taken care of. And those livery agents provide that. They provide feed, hay, forage, so forth, maybe some rudimentary veterinary care, certainly the shoeing of horses, which is called a farrier service. And so they would play the role, and they would do that quite well. And also, let's say you as the man, you dropped your horse off, and you went about your business, and you checked into the hotel, and you said, where is the barber? And he'd point you over across the street in a normal setting of a reasonable town. They'd say, go to that barber right there, and he'll get you cleaned up. So that barber will draw you a hot bath. You might not have had a bath coming off the ride for a week, maybe 2, maybe 3, who knows? So you need a hot bath. And you need a good clean shave to get all that. You don't wear a beard, and you want to get yourself cleaned up. You get a haircut, all those sorts of things there. And so this barber will take care of you, just like the livery agent takes care of your horse. Barbers not only are good about baths and baths and haircuts and so forth, but they're also good about selling patent medicines and tonics and such like that. So if you got a toothache, he might reach in and pull that tooth out. Because it's a rotted tooth. Sometimes these barbers doubled up as a dentist as well. What I guess you could say is you'll find in these small towns in the Midwest and in the Mountain West during this Old West time period, you'll find a lot of jack of all trades. You do find doctors, I should say, too. You will find doctors, but these doctors are sometimes good doctors, but oftentimes just frankly quacks. They don't know what they're doing. Maybe they were burnt out doctors from the Civil War, and they had seeing what they saw in the Civil War affected them in such a way that it drove them almost mad, but they drove them west, and they would sell patent medicines. The thing about patent medicines is that they are oftentimes laced with abundant alcohol properties, 50%, 70%, 80%. It's not uncommon to find alcohol in that high of a quantity. It is quite regular, in fact. But in addition to that issue right there, you do have the alcohol content quite high, and most of it's just snake oil anyways. But these doctors are just simply people you go to when you're in bad shape and you're hoping for, to get out of the fix that you're in. Many of these doctors are just simply not that good. But so we've got doctors, we've got farriers, which are livery agent, and so on. You'll also, by the way, there's one funny story is this livery agent sometimes acts as the barber, and he basically gives the livery agent gives a man who drops off his horse. The man had asked, "Where can I get a shave at?" And the hotelier says the livery agent is our barber as well. The livery agent was shoeing a horse. The man walks in and says, "I understand you're the barber." And the guy says, "Yeah, 25 cents. He waves the man over, "Come here." And he lays the man over his knee, pulls out from his hip pocket a straight edge razor, and proceeds to shave the man dry in his face. So if you've ever shaved dry, you know that hurts quite a bit. It's just like getting your hair ripped out. It feels like the barber's foam is a mighty advancement. Anyways, all of which is to say is that these guys, they have roles to play. So in these communities, you've got your barber, you got your doctors, your livery agents, your taverns and such. You need communications with the outside world. That's also something you need to keep in mind too. So a post office can get a community named for the guy who brought the post office to town. For example, in Snook, where I live, the name Snook is named for a fella. The town Snook is named for a fella, a Republican actually, who brought the post office to the community, and they changed the name of the town to Snook. So that was a development. No railroad around here, so this town never took off. Secondly, another way you can communicate with the outside world is, of course, through telegraphs and so on, later telephones, but especially in the early days, telegraphs. That especially is true if you have yourself a railroad running through your town. You have the ability to have that communication with the outside world. So you can find out, say, the winner of the 1888 election was none other than, Benjamin Harrison. Or you can find out that there was a great Chicago fire, and that has gone out in a bulletin across the wires. Instantaneous communications is a blessing in the late 19th century. Shoot, you can send out word to your territorial governor if something, say, a tuberculosis or a measles outbreak is underway in Yankton, South Dakota, or something like that. All of which is to say is that you want to be connected to the outside world, and these guys generally are. So in addition to the outside world, the most important business that you'd actually want in your community, it's kind of thought of this way historically, and it's going to sound counterintuitive because most people y'all's age who are watching this, and I'm assuming most people watching this are in the 18 to 22 territory, maybe 18 to 23. Most people who watch this do not take a newspaper. They don't read a newspaper, certainly not in the physical form, but not even in the physical form. They don't take a newspaper online or in a digital form like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or some other. I've read newspapers all my life. Even when I was a little boy, I read them. So it's a habit of a lifetime that I probably will never put down and lay aside. But newspapers are the most important business that you can have in your community. And that may sound strange. And you may think, why on earth wouldn't you want, say, a lawyer or something like that, or a bank? And yes, you do. The reason you want a newspaper is that the newspaper is going to tell the outside world about your little town. And these newspapers, unlike, say, the newspaper, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal that I just referenced a second ago, those newspapers are designed in one way or another to deliver the news and opinion about the news of the nation, about the news of the state of New York or the Wall Street or the locality of New York City. But the newspapers of a small town isn't designed to deliver the news in a hard reporting sense that's going to say, oh my gosh, we've had 10 murders in the last week because of the rough and rowdies at this bordello/tavern/inn. But the thing is that a lot of these little small town newspapers were created even before the town really existed to promote the town, and these newspapers would be picked up by the railroad oftentimes and carried points eastward, whether it's to the United States or even far east, all the way to Europe, as it were. And you would say, okay, fine, our little town is growing. We have a future. And essentially what you're doing is you're advertising through your newspaper, come move to our set town. Don't wait, buy now. You want cheap land? We've got cheap land. You want a future? We've got a future. In fact, Grand Isle, Nebraska, written as Grand Island, Nebraska, but not said that way. Grand Isle, Nebraska is a prime example of this promotion of a local town, this promotion of what we are planning to be, what we hope to be, what we want to be. And in fact, if you think of where Nebraska is on a map, which is in the middle of the nation, and if you think about a growing United States, the continental United States in the late 1800s, the thing is that Nebraska, particularly Grand Isle, Nebraska, is going to spin this yarn that basically says you need to move to Grand Isle now. You need to buy into Grand Isle now because there is going to be great things in our town. We are in the middle of a nation that is growing, and it stands to reason that eventually the capital of the United States will be moved away from Washington, D.C., and moved all the way out to probably the center of the nation. And guess where the center of the nation is? Nebraska. And just guess where the most likely place, the center of the nation. So Grand Isle, Nebraska has to be where the new capital will be. And they promoted it as such. Now, how many people actually bid on it? Not as many as you'd think, but the point I'm trying to make is simply these little newspapers, regardless of the community, are designed oftentimes to promote the best of the community, to talk about what we're doing good. And if you have family or friends who come from small towns or even towns such as Bryan-College Station, the local newspaper will talk about, an occasional murder or so on, but far more often they are promoting what the local school's up to, promoting what the glory of Texas A&M is, promoting how you need to retire to this territory, using Bryan-College Station as an example. So that's not unusual even in a modern sense, but that is the most important business because it got your name into the public and people might see it and they might end up moving to your little hamlet. And some did. And some certainly did. And so anyways, all that to say is that we need two more major businesses. I mean, you can go on and exhaust this list out. You'd probably want churches and so forth, and it depends on the church, depends on the type of settlers you get. You get Scandinavians like you do in the upper Midwest and the Dakotas and western Minnesota. You're going to get a bunch of Lutherans, for example. If you are having people move out of the deep south, as you might have into the plains of Texas, you're going to see either Baptist, Methodist, or even what's called the Church of Christ, sometimes known as Campbellites, out around Abilene and into the Panhandle. So you will have churches, but it just depends on the community. It depends on how fast the churches show up or how thick they get. Sometimes they come quickly, sometimes less so. But the other two or three that we would want to have in our community, really two other professions you want to have. One is you won't think of it, most people think of it as a pestilence, and they can be, I suppose. And but at the same time, you got to have them. Whether it's because you got arrested and you need somebody to defend you, or you're buying a piece of property and you want to record the title to the land. You need a deed to the land, and that is going to be a lawyer. Lawyers, it was said about them about 300 years ago, the three great scourges of mankind were doctors, lawyers, and preachers. Yeah, and so, lawyers, and some of you may want to be a lawyer. I see that from time to time in students. But lawyers have a real part to play in society. Like I said, defends you in a trial. That's the dramatic stuff, but that's not the normal thing. But just simply buying and holding deeds of property. And you may hold a piece of paper, but it has to be recorded somewhere. It's going to be recorded in a courthouse or a legal warehouse, so to speak. But that has to be done, and those documents have to be drawn up, at least in the basic sense, by a lawyer, because there is a prescribed manner by which these things are recorded to assure that that land or that house or all the above, that claim on a mining claim is yours. So you need lawyers. And then think of this also. If you have anything of value, and this is true to the 2020 as I'm recording this, you're going to want to record in the courthouse. You're going to want to draw up a legal document that says, this is my last will and testament. All of my earthly possessions go to Joe and Joanna, or all my earthly possessions go to the church, or all my earthly possessions go to my mother. Whatever the thing is, if you got something to give because when you die and you've got a lot, particularly, or you got enough, you might want to say, give it to this kid, he's a good kid, and don't give it to that kid because he's a ne'er-do-well. Lawyers draw up wills. And again, depends on the state, depends on the exact rules of the state. But as time sweeps on, as you get into the late 19th and early 20th century, you start to see more and more of those little old paper wheels that Daddy scratched out and witnessed late in his life just don't stand up in court. You have to have a lawyer draw up a basic document. That's especially true to this day. So lawyers, extraordinarily important. You have a lawyer or a cadre of lawyers in your town, it's a pretty good sign you're doing okay. But in the 19th century, in the building of these towns, you're also going to want a bank. A bank, like a newspaper, like businesses, a bank promotes optimism. A bank says we have money. A bank says we hope to have more money. A bank says, look at our money and don't you want some of that money? And I think of that, I used an example out of San Francisco, which is actually an established city well before the gold rush. One of the things you'll see in San Francisco and some of these other mining camps are these banks that are started, and what you look at and you say, oh my gosh, look at the gold bars, look at the silver bars, come out of the Comstock lode or come out of Tombstone or wherever. Look at that, oh my, there's money here, and don't you want to be a part of that? Oh yes, and so a bank is, yes, a repository of wealth. It is a safe haven for money. I don't discount that a bit. Can loan money, of course, too. But it is also in the idea of this promoting of a town. It says, we have a future, and don't you want to get some of it too? And most people who are moving westward have dreams. They're not moving westward for the most part for religious liberty. I mean, the Mormons in Utah would be an exception to the rule. But the fact is that the vast majority of the people moving westward in the post-Civil War era are moving for a hope of a better life in some form or fashion, most of which hinged on some sort of economic advancement. So don't you want to be with us? Oh, of course. So we've got these towns built. We've got them going. We've got it underway. So a couple of things next is, let's talk about what would make the towns go besides, obviously, the farming and the railroads. What I want to talk about next is the issue of the cow, the cattleman, and so on. Cows in the cattle kingdom does not begin in the United States. In fact, actually, cattle begin, or the cattle industry as we understand it, begins really in Spanish Texas and in Mexico in the Spanish period of Mexican and Texas history. The thing is that in the early 1700s, you start to see cattle being brought up and out of Mexico. Early 1700s, these cows will be given to the missions and the presidios that are designed to hold, settle, and to advance the territory that the Spaniards are trying to manipulate. You'll see missions and presidios in Texas particularly. They will sprout up in the 1700s in about 3 major areas. There's more to it than just that, but for our purposes in a 1302 class, I won't go deep into the history. But the 2 major areas that were worth noting, that where you find the great mission presidio complex setups in Texas is one, San Antonio de Bejar. San Antonio de Valero is the first of the missions that will be built in that area. San Antonio de Valero is named for St. Anthony, the patron saint of the mission, and Valero, Governor Valero, who green-lit it. And so San Antonio de Valero later is known as the Alamo, which many of you have actually visited. So that's the first of those missions there in San Antonio. And there's going to be others like San Juan Capistrano, San Jose, Mission Concepcion, and so on. But there's that, and then you have the presidios that are around there, Presidio de Bejar. That was the military component that was designed to protect the mission. And then, of course, you have in Spanish practice what is called the Villa, which is the town that was laid out around the mission presidio complex. Not all of these missions have these towns, but in this case we do, the Villa de Bejar. So if you actually get to reading in Texas history, Texas history, let's just use that, and you start hearing people talking about Bejar, they're talking about San Antonio. San Antonio kind of becomes the name of the town in the 1840s, and it was used a little bit before then, because you'll see old Ben Milam say, "Who will come with Ben Milam into old San Antonio?" But most of the locals are going to talk about Bejar, and most of the locals will be known even outside of us San Antonio. Outside of San Antonio, they will be known as Bejarinos. Anyways, that's one. The second, and in some respects better example of cattle production and cattle raising in Texas, the great beginnings of the cattle kingdom of Texas, isn't found in San Antonio. Though there is actually abundant grasslands on the west side, excuse me, the east side of San Antonio. If you're familiar with San Antonio's geography, you know up toward the Alamo Stadium, up toward, what is it, Trinity University, North Star Mall, you start to see the hills of the hill country. But you go east toward Judson, you go east toward Seguin, you go east toward Kirby, or just even south, just right south of downtown, you notice the ground starts to turn black because that is the blackland prairie of Texas. And all that land headed down toward the coast from the edge of San Antonio today all the way to the coast is, in some respects or another, is going to be the blackland prairie. And that is some of the great grasslands. Thousands and thousands and thousands of head of cattle will be brought into Texas, and they will populate that territory, and they will reproduce quite liberally. And so between it and the second great area is the second great Mission Presidio complex in Texas is called La Bahia. La Bahia, to you and me, we know it as Goliad. Goliad's down south and west of Victoria by about 25, 30 miles. But the thing is that all that land from around Victoria and Goliad, that too is the great grasslands, great prairies. I mean, just as far as the eye can see, abundant water and good grass, and cattle love it. And the cows that come up out of Mexico and are the seed of the Texas cattle herds, the native, if you want to call it, Texas herds, are longhorns or something akin to a longhorn. Rangy, ugly, frankly, not only just that, but hardy. They're tough cows. A lot of leg, a lot of horn, not a lot of meat. But man, they can survive in that unforgiving environment, especially the environment south and west of, say, I-37. I-37, if you don't know, connects Corpus Christi, which is on the coast, the city of Corpus Christi, with San Antonio. And everything west and south of I-37 is brush country. It's almost like the flipping of a switch. But those cattle survived there, and they thrived on those prairie grasses, and they were good cows. Some of them will be sent to in the American Revolution to the Americas, to the American cause and so forth. It's the only contribution Texas gives. But at the end of the day, that is the Texas cattle kingdom and where it begins. Some of them will go feral or they will go wild, and you'll find the Texas cows. You'll find them throughout what's called the Nueces Strip. You will find them throughout South Texas, and essentially they are what are called, for your notes, mavericks. A maverick cow or a maverick calf is a calf that has no formal owner. And these maverick calves, named for a family supposedly in San Antonio, the Maverick family, Samuel and later Maury Maverick. But the thing is that they're unbranded, ownerless calves, free for the taking. And so you'll see them being drawn up and pushed out of Texas in the 1860s. But I want to say this too also before I forget this. The thing is that the first cowboys, and when we think of cowboys and cattle drives, the first cowboys weren't Anglo. The first cowboys were not African American. In fact, some of them will be later on. A good number of them will be Anglo, and some will be African American in the post-Civil War era. But the vast majority of the way cowboying is done takes its heritage not from the Anglos or from the slaves. It takes its heritage actually from the Hispanic culture of Texas and Mexico. And the cowboys, the vaqueros, take their heritage or their practices and habits not from dealing with cows initially. They take their practices and habits from Mustanging. Los Mustangers, I believe is the way you pronounce it. To be a Mustanger, which was a tough job. To be a Mustanger in the 18th century or the 17th century, you had to be a tough man, a tough hombre. It was an unforgiving thing, and much of we consider rodeos and rodeo like bronco busting and so forth can kind of take, maybe not in a direct line, but can take lineage from those Mustangers out of Mexico. And then the Mustangers, as cattle start to really show up in numbers in Texas, a lot of the practices, and I could go into detail about this, but I won't on this lecture, but a lot of the practices on how to capture and how to hold on to and how to corral. That's a term as well. Corral de rodeo, I believe it was. But anyways, corral Mustangs will be used and applied to cattle. And so these cowboys or these Mustangers before them, they are going to cut a interesting and a very distinct figure in South Texas. They were some really impressive dudes. You can see I've got a little bit of an affection for them because I take a little bit of my heritage, at least in the cow side, from that. Not because of any DNA that I have. It's not because I don't have any Mexican or South American DNA. I don't have any Spanish DNA in my blood, but at the same time, the heritage would be in the cattle stuff. A cow, however, can also be, as far as these cattle drives are concerned, I should talk about that for a minute and move on past the vaqueros and the Mustangers. The thing is that those cows are going to be driven north, and in the post-Civil War era, especially in the 1870s, it's really in the 1870s where you see this, is there's going to be a pent-up demand for beef, and beef starts to rise as it doesn't supplant pork, it does not supplant other meats, but it does start to rise as a viable option for your dinner plate. And so there is a value in beef, and there is a value in driving cattle northward to these cow towns. Two names, there are more cow towns than this, but the two big ones for our purposes in a survey class, on a survey lecture, the two that we need to make note of is Dodge City, Kansas, and also Abilene, Kansas. Both of those towns are important because they're railhead towns. And what they're going to do is they're going to drive these Texas Longhorns or other associated breeds of animals, no Herefords and Angus at that point in time. But they're going to drive them to those Kansas railheads, and they're going to load those animals. If they don't slaughter them there on site or in the area, which they mostly don't, they're going to take them to slaughterhouses in Chicago and in Kansas City. You need to mark that down. Those are the kind of the destinations for those slaughterhouses or for those cows. They'll be driven north, and the men who do it mostly are going to be young men. Cattle driving and being a cowboy is a young man's trade, especially the way it's done on those cattle drives. You're going to be in the saddle for 8 or 10, 12, 14 hours a day. You're going to be doing it in probably hot weather, dusty weather. You would hopefully be good enough to be at the head of the drive, but especially if you're young and new, you're going to be in the back end and on the sides, which means you get to eat a whole lot of dust and a whole lot of other stuff too, potentially. Then you also at nighttime have to watch it from time to time over your herd so that no marauding wolves or natives or anybody else tries to steal the herd or stampede it. And so what you'll actually get out of this too, and it kind of plays into the issue of the cowboy, is that you get what are called singing cowboys. Singing cowboys are, obviously country music, at least a part of country music takes its heritage there. Country music actually starts out in the South, but by the time you get the 1930s and especially the 1940s, you get this idea of the singing cowboy, like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and even Bob Wills in the Western swing facet of it. But the singing cowboy, and that's actually true. These you sang to your cowboy, you sang to your cowboy, you sang to your cows, you talked to your cows, you hollered at your cows, you called your cows, you whistled to them, you spoke to them. It's kind of like the little dog that's you may never have seen it before, but if you look up RCA, their trademark, their patented trademark was basically the dog is looking into, it's a kind of a, it's a white dog. What is not a Doberman? Gosh, I can't think of it. It's not a lab. Oh gosh. Anyways, it's a white dog. I know the breed, and I can't think of it right off the top of my head. I'm just telling these stories. Anyways, he's got the little eye patch, and he's looking into the speaker, and it's the term is his master's voice, and that was their trademark. That was their patented line, his master's voice. He heard his master's voice, and he was looking at it, and he couldn't understand it. Same idea. You talk to your cows enough, you get around your cows enough, they can become like pets. But even if they don't become pets, you can talk to them and you can sing to them, and it's kind of a interesting sort of thing. So anyways, they drive them to these cow towns, Dodge City and Abilene, and those are wild and woolly. Some of the stuff that you hear about them is true, some of it's not. We'll probably talk about that in another lecture. But these cowboys who did not go on the cattle drives, they too had, there were plenty of cowboys who worked on big ranches and medium-sized ranches. I'll give you three big ranches for your notes. One is very famous. Some of you may dream and may even own, or mom and dad own, a King Ranch Ford truck. Well, the King Ranch Ford truck, by the way, is obviously an allusion to the King Ranch of South Texas, south of Corpus Christi. If you've taken Highway 77 and boogied from Kingsville all the way down to the valley, you can run probably 90 to 100 miles an hour down that road. Hopefully you don't have an accident, but anyways, most don't. But you can make up some time, and all that land through Kennedy County is part of the old King Ranch to one degree or another. And it was it was where some of those cows get driven northward. Another big ranch far north in Texas was the Wagoner Ranch, up around Wilbarger County and Wichita Falls and that part of the world. So second one was, and the third one is and I like this one as well, it's called the XIT Ranch up in the Panhandle. Stands for 10 in Texas, XIT. X is the Roman numeral 10. 10 in Texas. What is it, 10? 10 leagues of land. What were those 10 leagues of land? The state of Texas gave some Chicago businessmen 10 leagues of land in exchange for building the Texas State Capitol that some of you visited here in your high school years or your junior high years. All of those were big ranches, plus others that you can talk about that weren't quite as prominent. And to live on those ranches meant you were a cowboy. And if you've ever seen a young man's apartment or a young man's condo, in a sense, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Those young men who were cowboys, those apartments or condos that you may have visited sometime during the school year, sometimes, hopefully, they're all clean as clean as a whistle, but I'm guessing probably not. The second thing, too, though, is that that was true back in the day. A lot of manure, a lot of dirt and dust. Flies are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, especially if the bunkhouse or the cabin is close to the corral. They would sometimes they put stuff on the walls that are lewd, and whether that's today or in the past. Perhaps they wallpapered the cabin in the times gone by in the cowboy era. They'd wallpaper those cabins with Sears and Roebuck catalog entries and so forth, and they just spread it all over the place. And if it was hot enough and the breeze was not good enough, you might just simply sleep out in the open, out in the yard, and that happened as well. So these cowboys are mostly men, and that's always what you need to remember about those cow towns, is that lots and lots of men and very few women, and some women, but not a whole lot. But what I can say about the cowboys is these cowboys, when they work, one of the things they're going to do to cattle, and let me just be brief about this, they're going to mark a cow up. They're going to work cattle, as it's said. How do you work your cows? Several basic ways. First of all, you're going to the cow, especially if you've got to deal with a cow and they've got these big horns, and I'm not talking about necessarily the longhorn of fame, but just they've got a big set of horns. You may cut those horns down, and that is going to cause a problem and a mess. Secondly, you're also going to, especially the bulls that are not as desirable, and the bulls you're going to sell. Let's be clear about this, in herding cattle and husbanding cows, you're going to sell 95% of the bulls, maybe more. Why are you going to do it? Well, you don't need one bull, one cow. That's not how they work. You have 2 or 3 bulls, depends on the herd size. But, if you've got 50 cows, you can get by with about 2 bulls. Anyway, so you don't need a bunch of bulls. So you take those bull calves when they're young, hopefully, and catch them when it's cool, preferably, and you're going to castrate them. You're going to turn them into steers. So you're going to castrate them, and you can use various methods to do that. Pocket knives, Verdiscos, rubber bands. Back in the day, it was mostly just a pocket knife. And then, of course, also you want to let everybody know whose cow that is. Not the bull, but the cow. And so what you'll do is you'll brand a cow. You'll brand these cows, and you'll apply the brand to them. It's a hot iron brand, and you got to get that cow on the ground because there's not a squeeze chute at that time period to do the job. And so there you go. All of which is to say it is a tough business. It's a young man's trade. Well, we'll wrap up today with a brief look at the mining camps. And these mining camps, to change away from the cowboys, these mining camps are also in their own right wild and woolly. So, in fact, actually, I take that back. It's 53 minutes right now. That's a good place to stop, and I'll start in the next lecture with the mining camps. So, anyways, that'll do it. We'll see you next time.